I want to ask both of you, get both of your opinions on this one issue, which I have seen in recent months broad-based support from for pretty much every sector, every ideological sector, and that's repealing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
So my own view is that I have so many different thoughts. One, sort of a basic legal principle is that if you promote something, you're liable for it. So
well, maybe we should start with just explaining what Section 230
right.
is.
So Section 230 provides broad immunity for platforms. Even though, by the way, even the word platform suggests that there are these even neutral things out there that that modify their fundamental neutrality, which they aren't. But that provides broad immunity for the content that is shared on the sites. The reason that I focus more on the approach that I am taking is that repealing Section 230, and there's some things that I would change in Section 230, and they're not trivial, but starts to treat the platforms more like publishers and say, hey, they are like publishers. Let's hold them responsible the way that we would hold Glenn and all of you now are publishers, presumably. So if you,
I'm responsible for everything you say, so be very careful.
No, but not just with with basically the violations of whole sets of civil rights laws and other laws that you are responsible for the content that is shared, which is why there's fact-checking teams at publications that you have to be careful before you share certain information if you are a publisher. And I actually think the better route is to allow for an infrastructure that is neutral, and then have publishers on that infrastructure. And so my concern about the 230 direction is that it says, okay, now that we understand that Facebook or YouTube are basically like publishers, they should be liable like publishers. In the interim, I think just as a basic matter of law, and this might actually get us back to the same neutrality, anything that is promoted, you should be liable for. So if you allow it, it's one thing, but if you actually pick and choose, and we didn't hit on a key data point. Facebook's own data shows that 2/3 of the people who joined extremist groups did so because it was recommended to them, not because. Mm-hmm. So it's like you get in the train and Facebook says, I think you should go to car 3, where there's a lot of conspiracy theories. That seems like where you would like to be, as opposed to you get in the train and sit where you want.
So there's an editorial aspect, a curatorial aspect to it. But does that extend to an algorithm? Does it, or because that's a bit different from, saying, an editor in a newspaper who decides what to put in the newspaper?
I mean, I somebody's always driving the car doesn't mean you know all the details of how the engine works. I think sometimes the language of algorithm makes people feel like they're inadequate in regulating.
My girlfriend makes me feel like that. Yeah.
So my own view would be that it's important to recognize. I mean, we've created these incredible incentives to basically monopolize and then allow illegal activity and then profit off of illegal activity, and that's an untenable situation. The question is, what direction how do you respond to that? So my response is something that is more along the lines of a non-discrimination approach. You might get the same way by modifying 230 to say, if you actively promote the content as opposed to allow the content, then you're liable for it. But that would, since everything is now curated, it basically puts everything in that pot. So that's my own perspective on it. I'm really interested to see where Glenn is on 230.
You know, it's interesting because it is a complicated question, and the reason it's complicated is because it's based on a model of the internet that really almost no longer exists. And I think it's so interesting to think about what that early model was. The idea of Silicon Valley early on was, a lot of them were these kind of libertarian pioneers of, utopian visions of what the internet would bring. And free internet, or free and open internet, was in a lot of ways like the driving vision, not of all of them, but many of them. And so when these platforms started emerging, one of the things that people loved most about them was anonymity, that you could just say what you want, be what you want. It was the thing that was so liberating. Obviously, that's all gone. The ability to communicate without being within corporate constraints or subject to institutional rules, that's all gone as well. But the main thing was they never wanted this responsibility or this power to pick and choose what content would be promoted or what content would be allowed or what content would be banned over their site. The model that they were always pitching, and this is where 230 came from, was, look, you can't hold us responsible for millions of people who are posting. It's going to destroy our business. We're not picking and choosing between what is and isn't allowed. We're just offering a content neutral platform. We're kind of like AT&T, right? Like,
right. Keep in mind, 230, is not about Twitter or Facebook. It's about ISPs. It's about web hosts.
Well, and it's also, I remember when I first started blogging, like early on, one of the big concerns was if you're a blogger and you have a comment section and somebody comes and leaves a comment section defaming somebody else or intimidating or threatening somebody else, can you be sued for those comments by virtue of the fact that you essentially have published it? And so this whole concept of 230 and then these court decisions that said you're not responsible were based on the premise that Silicon Valley was promoting, which is that we're going to be like AT&T. If Alex Jones calls Milo Yiannopoulos on AT&T on the telephone and says, hey, let's organize a Stop the Steal rally or an alt-right rally, nobody expects AT&T to monitor that call and intervene and cut off their service because they say we're a content-neutral platform. We don't make decisions about what can and can't be said over our platform. That was the model these big tech companies wanted. And in reality, this obligation to censor and pull people off the internet for saying things that were dangerous was foisted upon them by activists, principally by journalists who were scared that too much free-flowing independence could threaten their control over the internet. Maybe they didn't want to censor, but once they start algorithmically promoting certain things at the expense of others, aren't they on some level then really like a publisher, which means that this immunity that was justified on the grounds that they're not a publisher is now really no longer applicable.
And Glenn, isn't there another aspect of it where they have incentive to just self-monitor because Facebook wants to create an environment that's okay for your grandma and not just nonstop porn and obscenities the way the internet tends toward when there is no moderation whatsoever. It's not just, it does feel like there's a way that they started to dip their toe into that water. Because all of these websites, like Facebook, the genius of Facebook at first was that you needed a college login to log in. And so it created its own kind of community. It's obviously a lot of class implications of that, but it created a certain kind of community and a certain kind of feel. And then I remember discussions about, if this opens up, I was in the first cohort of Facebook users.
Okay.
Right. February 2000, February 2004.
I can't believe you admit that.
I remember back when you put your class schedule in and you could track the boys you thought were cute, like all of that stuff. So, I remember when it was like, it's going to other schools that weren't just Harvard. How's that going to change the culture? And now it's going beyond the Ivy League. And now high school students can have it. How's that going to change the culture? And now it's open to everybody. And it does seem like part of the incentive for certain kinds of outlets is to say, well, let's not have you have to have some kind of moderator to make sure it's not just porn largely.
Yeah, I think the point that Zephyr made earlier is so important. I never actually quite thought about it this way, but I think it's so true. It is so twisted that we have to debate the decisions of Mark Zuckerberg and, Jeff Bezos and Tim Cook about who is and isn't allowed on the internet as though they're philosopher kings whose power we recognize the legitimacy of, and all we're left to do is kind of like try and cajole them the way we pressure our members of Congress. But I think that the point that Zephyr made is such an important one, which is the starting point of all these discussions has to be that the power that they have in their hands is simply intolerable and unsustainable to have a healthy democracy. And that everything that we do ought to be devoted to breaking up and eroding and undermining and destroying that immense power that's way too powerful in the hands of anybody. And so to answer your question, Bree, I do think that, these sites grew so rapidly and into something that they obviously could never have envisioned they would become. Mark Zuckerberg obviously not think that he was going to become this kind of global overlord of people's speech when he created Facebook. It happened very quickly and on some level almost unintentionally.
Yeah,
but
he wanted
once
to judge
you
if
put that
Harvard
power,
kids were hot or not.
yeah, that was his goal. But once you put that power into people's hands to literally, change governments all over the world, put people out of business, change leaders, I just think it's incredibly corrupting. And so at this point, when Facebook does something, I think it's very hard to say, are they doing it because of some self-interest or profit motive? Are they doing it because they want to foster some political outcome? Are they doing it because the public demands it? Or are they doing it because they just kind of have that power in their hand and humans use power?
It can get almost farcical if it weren't so dark. Facebook has set up a Supreme Court. They're sort of playing at government, but the costs are extraordinary when you look at what has happened in countries around the world, when you look at the genocide in Myanmar, which was facilitated by Facebook's algorithmic amplification. The idea that Zuckerberg then appoints a bunch of law professors and experts in government, trying to replicate government, but without any of the accountability and any of the
transparency.
Transparency. And so then there are terms of service, and the terms of service change. And I think what is so terrifying about what's happened in this last week is that, we have terms of service. Apple broadly has terms of service that say effectively what we don't like, which is really dangerous because these have direct political effects. And I just can't underline what Glenn is saying enough. Decentralization. When it comes to communication, you want a decentralized public sphere because the other option is either explicitly state-run or a state, but an illegitimate state like Zuckerberg. And those are both terrible options. So that busting up and allowing for more decentralization, so your grandma can be in one world and you can have different social media environments is so important.
Well, I know you have to go, but I do want to drill down on this point before you do. I get the argument of decentralization. I understand that you don't want basically all of these companies owned by the same person, but there is also the desire to have the beauty, the utility of these companies is that they are centralized to a certain degree. So, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook shouldn't be owned by the same person, but we don't want 15 Facebooks because I don't want to have to join them all to find out where my aunt is or the kid I went to 5th grade is with is,
yes.
Right? So in a world where we still have Facebook on its own, that's enormous and powerful, and we still have Google on its own, which is enormous and powerful, and Instagram independently, which is enormous and powerful, is that enough to guarantee the kinds of free,
So I think no. I think no, and I do think that some kind of size metric matters. Like if you want to have very small communities that run with a targeted ad business model, there's no skin off democracy's teeth. That's a terrible version, but that at a certain scale, there is a value to having networks and like railroads and phone systems, and then you basically say you are subject to non-discrimination obligations.
That part of it, yeah.
And there is a little cost. As a friend of mine said, on the one hand, you won't get that green shoe that you never thought you would love, but actually love. On the other hand,
ads, they do know me.
You could have a self-governing society. So I don't want to pretend. I don't want to pretend there's zero cost, but it's like the stakes are so high.